Hello and welcome back to Module 3. In the last two modules, we have talked a lot about Azure automation. While Azure automation is important, the concepts of runbooks, the concepts of DSC apply a lot to IaaS. But Azure is much bigger than IaaS. Azure encapsulates IaaS as well as PaaS. And so in this module, we're going to open up and look at the broader offerings within Azure. At the same time, assess the different automation solutions that are available for these offerings within Azure. Let's start off by looking at the evolution of Azure. Now, Azure's gone through its own evolution over the years. When Azure was first introduced, it was introduced as Azure Service Manager. Azure Service Manager, to be honest, was just a hosting solution. The idea was, let's create a hosting platform for the masses. And that's exactly what it was. So if you wanted to quickly provision a server in Azure, well, it was a matter of clicks to do it. If you wanted to provision two servers, it was again a matter of clicks to do it. Could you automate that process? Yeah, to a fair extent you could. But what was missing was the concept of lifecycle management, the concept of application management, the concept of environment management. Now let's take an example. In Azure Service Manager, if you wanted to provision a web server farm, then you had to manage the provisioning process yourself. You had to create a load balancer, but hold on, the load balancer needs the web server details. So you had to figure out that the dependency between these two solutions means that the web server needs to be deployed ahead of the load balancer. And if you needed two web servers, then you had to deploy the first one, then deploy the second one, then provision the load balancer, then register the nodes with it. So all of that dependency management you had to figure out yourself. While it was a great hosting platform where you could get any scale of resource as in when you needed it, but the dependency management, the deployment, the automation, the integration had to be figured out by you. Now, Azure V1 was a great learning exercise for Microsoft, and they scaled it to a great extent. And you still had API access, you still had programmatic access, PowerShell access, Azure SDK access. And then they took these learning and these artifacts that they created and brought them forward into what's called Azure V2, i.e. Azure Resource Manager. While it still is a great hosting platform, but it's far more intelligent now. It understands the fundamentals of application lifecycle management. It understands the intelligence of environments management. So when you tell Azure Resource Manager that you need a web server farm and you need one load balancer and two web servers, it can figure out the dependencies. It knows that the web servers need to be provisioned first ahead of the load balancer. It knows that it needs to integrate the two by registering one with the other. So it abstracts that complexity away from you and builds it into the platform, which again, alongside the hosting, makes it an intelligent cloud platform. Now, having established that Azure's gone through its own evolution and where it is in its journey today, the bigger offering has a lot of automation solutions to offer. So what exactly does Azure Resource Manager offer? Azure Resource Manager gives you a great infrastructure management platform, which provides you with a resource grouping capability. So you could now pretty much call out the resources that you need and bundle them up logically into a container. And that container is called a resource group. So let me take an example. If I'm hosting a site core environment, which has a few web servers, one PaaS database, a load balancer, a public IP address, a few NSG rules, then I could bundle all of them up into a resource group. So when I say I need a resource for my site core application, I'm asking for a substitution of this resource container or another instance of this resource container. And so that's the level where you manage the application lifecycle rather than figuring out the dependencies. What it also offers you is the capability of figuring out, the platform is capable of figuring out the resource dependencies, so you don't have to do that hard work. It gives you a way of setting up repeatable deployments. Now, a concept that we talked about and its application, as we've seen with DSC, is built right into the platform. So when you say, I want to set up a resource group with these artifacts and with these configurations, if you rerun the script that provisions this resource group, it will simply validate that all the resources are there. And if they're there, it's not going to try to redeploy it. So it's idempotent in a way. The other thing it offers you is deployment templates. So this entire setup of creating a resource group with all the resources in it can be scripted in a template. And it's no more like a complex scripting language that you have to use, or go and learn a new language. It just leverages the JSON notification. Whereas Azure Classic was a lot based on XML, the new Azure Resource Manager is very, very lightweight and runs off the open source JSON notification format. The other thing that was missing in the Azure Server Service Management solution was you had some crazy permissioning model. You either had to be a subscription administrator or a subscription co-administrator, and the moment you got those accesses, well, you had pretty much access to the whole subscription. Whereas in reality, if you're managing an enterprise workload in the cloud, you're not going to be you're not going to be managing the entire state. You're probably going to be focusing on a few applications, maybe a few servers, maybe a few resource groups. What Azure Resource Manager gives you is a strong RBAC, role-based access control, where you could nick and pick which resource groups you need access to and what level of access do you need. You could pin down to any specific Azure service or any specific Azure resource provider and say, this is the kind of access you need. So it really gives you the enterprise-style permissioning model when you're managing your infrastructure. And last but not the least, you get fine-grained granular billing capability. At the same time, you get tagging, whereby you could tag certain resources in unique ways. Now, tagging is a form of a metadata. So, for example, if within my resource group, certain things I wanted to classify in a certain way, well, tag's the way to do it. Now, let me take an example. In this training, I'm creating a lot of assets or resources within the Azure subscription. I'm secretly creating a tag behind all of them which says, that they're for training. So afterwards, I'm just going to run a script which will look for the tag temporary and delete all the assets. And you could use it for different purposes. I've seen organizations using tagging for patch management, where the tags would simply call out what level of patching needs to go on the server, and it will just read the tag and schedule the patching on those servers accordingly. So that's what Azure Resource Manager in a nutshell offers you. Now let's look at the architecture of the Azure Resource Manager. At the center of everything is the workload that Azure offers. You've got PaaS workload and IaaS workload. Now, all of these, if you think about it, are really just providers. If you have uh, a capability or a workload, it's a provider that a consumer can consume. So Microsoft.compute is a provider. Now, within Microsoft.compute, you can have different resource types. You could have availability sets, you could have virtual machines, and so on and so forth. What you have on a layer above that is ARM resource providers. So if you interact with the ARM resource provider, it will tell you the capabilities of the resources that it has. And on a layer above that, you get the resource manager. Now, the resource manager is exposed or can be consumed using an API that it exposes. So the ARM REST API has several clients that it has that can use can connect to it. For example, PowerShell, Azure PowerShell is one of the consumers of the ARM REST API. The Azure CLI is another consumer of the ARM REST API. Now, if you're not familiar with Azure CLI is the open source cross-platform toolset for managing all the Azure resource providers that you have within Azure. In this demo, we're not going to be covering Azure CLI, but the implementation is not very different from the ones that I'm going to show you within the Azure PowerShell. All right. Well, a lot of concepts covered here. Gladly, very quickly, we're gonna look at a demo now. In this demo, we're gonna start setting up our machine with everything it needs. I.e., the PowerShell modules, to start interacting with Azure RM. And then on top of that, we're going to run some commands or see some commands that are quite handy to understand or bring the architecture to light. Look at what the resource providers are, what the resource types are, what locations they reside in, and how the API works in the background. Okay, so I'm going to flip right into the demo. Okay, so I've got some commands here, to help me through the demo. But the first thing that you need to check when you're prepping your machine up to interact with Azure using PowerShell is whether you have the latest version of PowerShell installed. Now, in my setup here, I've got version 5 of PowerShell installed, and you can obviously download Windows Management Framework 5 if you don't have this set up already. And then the next thing to do is to make sure that you install the WinRM modules. The easy command to run to do it is install module Azure RM. I'm not gonna run it because I already have the modules installed. But what this would do is this would leverage the package management solution for PowerShell that's built into Windows Management Framework 5. Reach out to the PowerShell gallery, download all the modules for you, and set you up to interact with Azure. Once you've done that, now it's the time to authenticate yourself to Azure. And the easy way of doing that is by typing login Azure RM account. And this gives you a prompt to enter your credentials. Now, if you wanted to set this up or at least create a script that allowed you to interact with Azure in a way where you didn't have to put in your credentials, well, you can, of course, store your credentials in a PowerShell credential provider and then inject that, which means you're not going to get the prompt. But for this demo, we kind of don't need to do that. OK, now that I have logged in, and it's going to blink for a while because all it's trying to do is just re-authenticate me for every subscription that I have access to in the background. And if you're counting, I probably have access to 4 subscriptions. So let's look at it. So the next command we're going to run is get Azure RM subscription. And this will list out all the subscriptions that I have access to. Now, if you're an IT administrator in an enterprise, chances are you probably will have access to 5 or 6 Azure subscriptions, at least 3. And that's the trend I've seen in the generally across the organizations. So let me pick the subscription where I've been running the demos, and let me set the context of Azure RM to be focused on just this subscription. So I'll run the command of set Azure RM context and just use the subscription ID, key that in, and just wait for it to execute. Excellent. So it's executed. The next thing I need to do is just do a sanity check to make sure that the context is correctly set up and it's correctly set up to the right subscription. So we're good here. Now, going back to the slides, we talked about resource providers. Now, believe me, you're not going to remember all the resource providers that are out there. So there must be a command to quickly check out what resource providers are available in the subscription that you're working in. And no surprise that that command is called get Azure RM resource provider. Now, if you run this command, you kind of get the output, but not in a nice way. So you can format the output by just piping it and selectively just return the provider namespace and the resource types, and then just order the results by the provider namespace. A much better result. Now you can see that within the Azure subscription where I'm running the demos, I've got some preview features, I've got some other features, but the key ones that we've covered so far are Azure automation. And you can see that within the automation as well, the resource types that are available are automation accounts, runbooks, webhooks, and you kind of don't need to remember this as long as you have a fair idea of what the commands are. And even if you don't remember the commands, Windows PowerShell 5 is pretty good in helping you work out what the commands are. So for example, I could just type help Azure Azure provider, maybe Azure RM provider. And it's going to go off and do a search. And it tells me, well, from what you're searching, there are a few options. Maybe the one that you're looking for is the Azure RM provider. And then on top of that, if I wanted to get Azure RM provider, if I wanted to see an example of that, I can type help and then just say examples. And then it kind of helps me, well, I just need to select the right one, but it kind of helps me, shows me the examples as well for that commandlet. So let's select this one. Try again. Get Azure RM provider. And let's try running this again. Okay, feature examples. What doesn't like it? Anyways, you get the idea what it can help you achieve. Just by using the help keyword with the example tag, it kind of shows you the examples in principle. It doesn't always work in the demo though. All right, so now that we've seen what what provider namespaces are available and what resource types are available, next up we're going to look at the locations these namespaces are available in. Sometimes, to take the classic example of Visual Studio Team Services, now Visual Studio Team Services is not available across every Azure location. It's available in Europe, it's available in Australia, it's available in the US, but not in every data center. So similarly, if you're trying out a preview feature or a feature that hasn't made its way across all the locations, then by connecting to the subscription and running this command, you can figure out the specific locations that that provider is available in. Now, as you can see, the Microsoft Compute is pretty much available across all locations here. Now, in the architecture diagram, I showed you APIs. And Microsoft is constantly evolving those APIs. While most of those APIs are long-term supported, on and off they will release APIs in preview just to get some feedback on usage. And as long as you have the exact API version, you could create a URL as well to directly invoke the resource that you want to interact with. Now, behind the scenes, in this demo, if I was running Fiddler, I could actually see how these PowerShell commands are translating into the API commands being run against Azure to get the results, and how the results are fed then back into PowerShell. So if you run this command here, um, which is again leveraging the Azure RM resource provider, it instead focuses on getting the list of APIs that are available for this provider. So let's run this command. And you can see that the resource provider for the namespace Microsoft.compute has had, well, 6 or 7 API versions, of which there have been 2 versions in preview. So if there are certain features that have been released in preview that you want to try out, that you haven't officially been given access to, well, this is a way of figuring it out and getting access to it as well. Okay, so going back into the slides, we kind of wanted to cover. We kind of wanted to cover just exactly that. Look at the provider, look at the resource type, figure out how we can identify what locations that are available in, and then identify the API versions that are available. So this was a brief introduction of ARM, how we got here, and then just setting up your VM or your machine to gear up to connect into Azure so that we can start the automation journey here on.